So, after my recent Twilight review, you may remember, assuming you saw it, that I mentioned possibly reviewing the sequel movies and also spiritual successor 50 Shades of Grey at some point in future. Well, as it turns out, I kinda forgot there was another terrible Twilight-related project. That being the awful parody movie Vampires Suck. I found it on Amazon Prime, I watched it, and I figure I needed to talk about it. But I'm not merely going to be reviewing that movie, oh no. I want to talk about its failure specifically as a parody movie, and I want to talk about the directors known as Jason Friedberg and Aaron Seltzer, aka Seltzerberg, who seem to have made a living off of quite possibly the worst parody movies ever to hit theatres. Their past endeavours have included Date Movie, Epic Movie, Meet the Spartans, and the aptly named Disaster Movie. These films have become pretty infamous amongst film lovers, and, well, anyone with maturity beyond that of a 9-year-old, as being some of the most shallow, lazy pieces of quote-unquote comedy to ever grace theatres. And it's easy to see why. For starters, despite attempting to parody various movies, a lot of the time it's quite clear that the directors have never actually seen the targets of their satire, and are basing their jokes and premises purely off of the trailers for those movies alone. On top of that, some of the jokes are just flat out plagiarized from the original movies they're trying to parody. Most of the humour often comes from meaningless references, along with empty shock humour simply banking on the notion that being offensive equals comedy. Vampires Suck is often considered to be one of their better attempts at creating a movie, and having now seen it, wow, that speaks volumes as to how bad the previous movies were. I will grant this movie one thing, the whole film generally does follow the plot of Twilight and New Moon, to the point where I am pretty certain they actually watched the originals this time. The only other positive I can name for this movie is the fact that the lead actress is far, far too good for this movie. Like, she absolutely has Kristen Stewart's performance as Bella down to a T. I honestly wasn't expecting that, given how little of a damn people making these movies usually give. But yeah, kudos to her. Apart from that, honestly, I think this is a great example of exactly how to fail a parody. More so than the other Seltzerberg movies, since unlike the shallow cash grab garbage like Disaster Movie, Vampires Suck feels like it's actually trying to an extent, which makes its failure all the more interesting. For those who have not seen it, Vampires Suck is a parody of the first two Twilight movies. It follows the character of Becca Crane, a girl who moves to an obviously vampire-infested town and falls in love with Edward Sullen, only to later break up with him and begin a love triangle with obvious werewolf Jacob White. Okay, so here's the thing about parody. Most of the humour usually comes from poking fun at the original works, often through deconstruction. This can be done in a variety of ways, like, say, taking the protagonist of a work and putting them in a far more mundane or inappropriate scenario, or pointing out the ridiculousness of the original work by showing it in a more realistic light, or simply taking a serious situation from the original work and adding a comedic spin onto it. In the case of Vampires Suck, for the most part, the humour comes entirely from exaggeration and nothing more. So, for example, Jacob is a werewolf. This is shown through Becca noticing his very obvious dog-like features and mannerisms that appear throughout the movie. The problem is that the comedy here is far too predictable. Once you've done a joke of him chasing a cat, none of the following jokes are going to have any sort of impact because they all have the exact same punchline, delivered in the exact same manner. If, say, he had some subtle dog traits at first, then flat out showed up covered in fur the next time Becca sees him, this could work since a sudden escalation would actually be unexpected, but no, it's just the same joke every time. What makes this tragic is that Twilight is a franchise that should be extremely easy to parody, yet practically every attempt here fails because the only joke the creators can think up is, what if we took this scenario and just made it a bit more exaggerated? A great example would of course be the whole Edward sneaking into Bella's room at night plot from the original. Like, that should be an easy scene to parody. The notion that stalking someone and sneaking into their room could be considered romantic is something that flat out should be mocked. Like I said, pointing out the ridiculousness of the original work by making a scenario more realistic is a good way to do this. If, say, Becca had woken up and pepper sprayed Edward, and as he tried to defend himself, he realised actually there's no real excuse for his creepy behaviour, well, maybe there could have been potential for a joke there. Instead, all we get is Edward lovingly watching Becca sleep, only to find out she talks and thrashes about in bed. Again, it's nothing more than constant, loud, exaggerated nonsense, because there's no build, no subversion, and no real punchline. All you can really say about it is it's just loud noises. I'm no comedian, but if I were to rewrite this scene, I'd play it out like this. Edward watches Becca sleep and begins to deliver a flowery monologue about how peaceful and beautiful she looks and how he loves her. And as the camera focuses on this, however, Bella's snoring becomes audible and gradually gets louder and louder. We see Edward's expression become more and more pained and awkward as he desperately tries to ignore the snoring noise and continue to deliver the monologue, until, at the very end, Becca begins mumbling in her sleep and blurts out how she wants to have sex with Jacob. At least then, that would be an attempt at a punchline. Of course, it wouldn't be a commentary on Seltzerberg if I didn't also mention the pointless references. Let me make one thing clear when it comes to writing comedy. Never assume that anything is inherently funny in and of itself. Sex is not inherently funny. Bodily functions are not inherently funny. Being offensive is not inherently funny. And for the love of God, references are not inherently funny. While Vampires Suck is certainly not as bad as some of Seltzerberg's previous works, the pointless references have not exactly disappeared entirely. For example, there's a scene that features Alice from Alice in Wonderland hanging around in the woods near Becca and Edward, for absolutely no reason other than the fact that Tim Burton's live-action movie of Alice had just been released. There's just no joke here other than, hey, it's a character from another movie. That's the entire basis of the joke. On top of that, while a lot of people didn't especially like that version of Alice in Wonderland, I don't think anyone hated it enough for Alice's basic presence alone to be considered a punchline. Perhaps the most telling part of this movie is the fact that, unlike the shallow garbage these directors had previously released, as I say, it almost does feel like this one is actually trying to an extent, which honestly, given how bad it is anyway, just goes to show how much these two do not understand basic comedy. Now don't get me wrong, comedy is one of the most subjective genres in all of fiction, as everyone's sense of humour is gonna differ. But there are some general guidelines that I think can apply to the vast majority of comedy. First, comedy often comes from subverted expectations. A punchline works best when you don't see it coming. Second, as I say, do not assume that anything is inherently funny in and of itself. It's important that the punchline lands, and it's important that there is a punchline to begin with. When it comes to parody, often the worst thing you can do is purely aim for the low-hanging fruit, and only make the most obvious jokes. So, for example, mocking the obvious Team Jacob versus Team Edward fandom wars is pretty damn predictable, and since there are no clever spins on the joke, it just flat out isn't funny. To me, the ideal parts of Twilight to mock and parody would be Edward's extremely creepy behaviour, Bella's constant grumpiness despite having virtually no problems, and the fact that the two of them are so consistently overdramatic when it comes to their relationship. Yet barely any of this is mocked at all, because to do so would require actually putting in effort to deconstruct these tropes and cliches. And the fact of the matter is, these movies are not willing to put in any effort whatsoever. As a result, all of the mockery of the movie is, simply put, incredibly shallow. When it comes to parody, whether you love the work you're parodying or hate it, what's important is that you care about it. Because when you don't care and aren't really paying attention, then chances are what you're going to create will just be a shallow mockery that won't appeal to fans or haters, because every joke that's being told has already been pointed out before. As someone who hates Twilight, this movie to me was just a big pile of nothing. Like I said before, the only thing I could really praise it for is the fact that the actress playing Becca clearly does care about the source material, because her performance is so on point. To me, she honestly feels like the only person taking part in this movie that actually cared. And yeah, I know critiquing movies like this is kind of a lost cause, given most other folks working on this movie probably cared more about making money than making a good movie. But to anyone out there who does care about writing and maybe one day wants to write satire or comedy, consider the following. While trash like the Seltzerberg movies may exist and may make money, at the same time, there are plenty of highly successful satirical movies that have made money while still being well written and well regarded. Ultimately, if you have the choice to make money either way, wouldn't you rather do it through entertaining your audience as opposed to exploiting them? Thanks for watching the video. I'm probably not going to review any more of the Seltzerberg franchise, given, well, as I say, it's really easy to explain what's wrong, and often it's hard to give critique to something you know that the creators really didn't care about. That said, I may do a future review looking into exactly what makes a good parody, so stay tuned for that one if you're interested. As always, like, share and subscribe, and donate to me on Patreon if you can, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Goodbye.